Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. We want to welcome our friends in South Africa, the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Maurice Al-Arian. I'm pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. Brothers and sisters, friends of Salam Media and El-Hajj Maurice Al-Arian, last week, our topic was lessons from Gaza. This week, from a hotel room in Flint, Michigan, that's where I am right now, we're going to have a conversation with a good friend of mine going back a good number of years, a Palestinian academic, a former political prisoner, and a brother who is now leading the scholarly charge in Turkey at a university there, Dr. Sami Al-Arian. But before he and I begin our conversation for today, and you can guess that this broadcast is going to be focusing on what is taking place right now in occupied Palestine from a Palestinian academic's perspective, and not just any Palestinian academic, again, someone who was a former political prisoner because of his activism. I mean, not only was Dr. Sami Al-Arian, a leading academic in the U.S., having spent decades here, he was also a political activist. And in fact, if one person could be pointed, if most of the credit, and that's what it was at the time, it was credit, could be given to one individual for the outcome of a presidential election in the United States back in 2000, with the state of Florida being the deciding factor in that election, then that one person would have been Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who at that time was on a first name basis with a number of prominent political leaders in the U.S. Congress. Again, he was a very prominent Muslim political activist who led the charge on many issues. And let me also note that the reason why he deserved back then so much credit for the outcome of that presidential race is because he had made a request of the two front runners for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to do something about something that was a bane in the side of the Muslim community. Secret evidence was being used in the late 90s disproportionately against the Muslim community, and only one of the campaigns made a pledge to do something about it if they were elected, and that was the campaign that ended up getting a block vote from the Muslim community. If our brother wants to briefly touch on that when we begin our conversation, he's more than welcome to do that, to do so. But he was a very prominent political activist, highly respected, alhamdulillah, deeply admired by his brother Salih Khan. And after 9/11, this dramatic shift took place, and many of the folk who had been friends, fair weather friends of Dr. Sami Al-Arian and the Muslim community by extension, they did what many politicians do. And, the rest of, as they say, is tragic history. The lobby went after Dr. Sami Al-Arian. The Zionist lobby went after him with a vengeance. And our brother spent quite a bit of time in pretrial confinement before his trial that ended with a lot of egg on the face of those who brought the indictment against him, and he won overwhelmingly, despite the millions and millions of dollars that was put into prosecuting him. He won hands down, and that trial also revealed a lot of things that were uncomfortable for his antagonists. The jury, on the multiple charges that were brought against him, he was found innocent on all but, I believe, one charge. And that was one of the lesser charges that the government had the option of re-prosecuting him on. They really didn't want to go that route again because they had failed. They had lost so shamefully. They had lost that huge, costly trial for the American taxpayers, and so they offered him an opportunity to engage in a plea agreement for that one charge that the jury deadlocked on in his favor. And part of that agreement was that he would have to leave the United States, give up his U.S. citizenship. And so he ended up, what was a loss for the United States, and it was indeed a loss, ended up being a win, a benefit for Turkey, which is where he is now. But with all that being said, I kind of went on a little bit longer than I had planned with this very personal introduction, informal. But he's a friend. He's a friend that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And but before we get into our conversation, I want you to see about 11 minutes of video that will help set the tone for the conversation my brother, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, and I are going to have going forward for the rest of this hour, inshallah. So without any further ado, let's all go on and begin that video, Brother Sadiq.
With the Trump administration in power, Israeli politicians have been celebrating this new opportunity, ramping up settlement projects. Some of these are even financed by Trump's own son-in-law, rumored to be the president's pick to broker so-called peace in the region.
Can I reveal, Jared, how long we've known you?
While these illegal settlements grow into Palestinian villages, some are built directly in the middle of thriving cultural centers, such as Hebron, one of the most hyper-militarized cities in the world. When I was in Hebron, I was shocked by how aggressively the police state imposed an apartheid system. All of the residents I talked to had horror stories of life under brutal occupation. Sometimes Israeli soldiers themselves dissent, even in the face of very severe repercussions. One of whom is Iran Efrati, who was stationed in Hebron during his time in the Israeli army. Since leaving the military after years as a combat soldier, Efrati has dedicated his life to documenting Israeli war crimes and fighting the apartheid system.
Iran, you went from being a soldier in the IDF to being a very outspoken critic of both the occupation and continued takeover of Palestine. What made you go through such a profound transformation?
Well, it didn't something that happened immediately. Obviously, growing up in Israel, you ask me what was my role in the military. I'm not sure that my role started with my enlisted. I think my role started when I was about 5, and I realized that my father is putting uniform and going out to Lebanon as a reserve soldier. That's the first time I felt that I'm a part of the military. The next time was in kindergarten, when soldiers came in to tell us about the Independent War, just after the Holocaust Day Memorial. The next time will be when I was 16, and I will get my first draft letter. And in this draft letter, it will be written that I am a property of the military. This is something that every kid in Israel goes through. When you're getting into the military system, in the end, you're already so much embedded inside the military. The military is a part of your identity. It's as much you as you are Israeli or Jewish, for that matter, in Israel. And going into the military, I was expecting to be a manifestation of me, just in uniform, protecting my country, protecting my family. I grew up on hearing the stories from Auschwitz of my grandma. So my mother's side, my grandma and grandpa was the only survivors from their family, from the Holocaust. All of my grandma's family were killed in Auschwitz. The stories from my grandpa, that was also the only survivor from his family from the Holocaust. And from the other side, my grandpa and grandma from my father's side grew up on hearing their stories about Jerusalem and what it is to grow up without freedom under the British mandate. For me, being in the military is to protect them and to make sure that our life will go on as in freedom and in good will. I went through 7 months of boot camp, and in the end of the 7 months, I found myself in Hebron. This is the only city that have a settlement in the middle of the city. So getting into the Hebron, one of the first things that I had to do was protect a Jewish holiday. And my job is to put on curfew 180,000 Palestinians. So settlers throughout the West Bank and Israel, Jewish settlers, could come into Hebron and celebrate. So there's thousands and thousands of Israelis and Jewish settlers from across the West Bank coming to celebrate. And the only way to keep them protected is to make sure that no Palestinian is leaving his home. So literally one of my first tasks was to roam the streets and make sure Palestinians understand they're going into their home and they cannot leave until a second notice, until the next time we're coming in. And the first time was like a movie. We birthed into the city with our guns in our hands and our uniform and vest with grenades and 6 packs of ammunition. And we're just screaming curfew. And you see the chaos. You see the people just running from place to place, closing down their shops, running home. Because wherever you are when the curfew starts, this is where you're stuck. And you cannot go anywhere else. So you better be at home when we're starting to come the curfew. Now, the official orders to anyone who breaks curfew is shoot to kill. I never did that. I never met anyone who shoot to kill in this process of a curfew. But that was the orders, and they knew it pretty well. They knew what they need to do. This feeling of power at once came as a big confusion to me. I think I wasn't clear if I'm enjoying the power of controlling all of these people, or if I don't understand why kids look at me frightened. Why are they running away when I'm walking into the street? Before my service, I work as an educator. I love kids. So I think I was very confused on why a kid will find me scary. I realize now in perspective, it got to do something with the fact that I have my boots on, my uniform, my helmet, my 6 packs of ammunition, my 2 hand grenades, my M16 in my hand. But I didn't realize that at the time. Right. And I really couldn't understand that. And I think in a very rapid pace, I realized that my job is actually to maintain an apartheid system. Very early on, I understood that the rights that the Jewish settlers have are not the rights that the Palestinians have. I understood that I cannot touch a Jewish settler if he is attacking a Palestinian. The best I can do is call a local police department to come handle it. like I would do at home in Jerusalem. So these Jewish settlers that live in Hebron are living under the same rights that I live in Jerusalem, but the Palestinian next to them, next house over, next building over, sometimes next apartment over, lives under my rule, my military rule. And I can do whatever I want with him. I can take his home as a temporary base for a few hours to a few days to a few weeks. I can decide that I'm arresting the people of the house and tying them up to the fence of my base. If we will get an order to demolish their home or just lock their front door and don't let them out into the street their house is on, a street that only Jewish settlers can walk on and Palestinians cannot. So they have to walk through windows to yards, into the other side, into the Kasbah of Hebron. I think realizing all of that in a very, very early stage in my service helped me understood that someone was lying to me along the way. I didn't feel like I'm protecting anyone. I didn't feel like I'm helping anyone feeling more safe. I felt like I'm terrorizing people. I feel like for the first time in my life, the boundaries between good and bad that I learned as a kid, and obviously I learned that I'm on the good side, was broken. I felt like I am the terrorist. And my job was literally to scare people so they cannot think about acting against the Israeli settlers or the Israeli military. That was actually our defined mission, to make sure that to instill fear in the hearts of Palestinians in Hebron. And that's exactly what we did.
I think Hebron is a really intense example of apartheid, obviously. Like you just said, the settlements in the middle of the city, it's extremely visible. You have the cage streets, the ghost town. It's horrifying. Why did you speak up and why did you do what you did knowing that you would suffer such repercussions and potentially be banned from returning back to your country?
Well, growing up in Israel, like I said, I believe that I was the good guy. I mean, the story that all of us are being told all around the world is that the very clear difference between good and bad people are there. You learn about the Holocaust growing up. I saw my grandma screaming in the middle of the nights, memories from Auschwitz in our mind, memories to our family. I knew that I am going to be a good human being. You know, in the age of 15, 16, I began being almost obsessed with trying to understand the Nazi side in the Holocaust. Not only to hear the stories of the victims, of the Jewish victims and any other victims from the Holocaust, but to try to understand how can a Nazi soldiers get up in the morning, give his kids a kiss, his wife a hug, and go out to the camps and do his job. I just couldn't understand that. And when I got into the occupied territories, for the first time I understood how can there be a contradiction inside yourself. As a human being, you could do your job and be a one person at home, be a loving, caring boyfriend or a son or a brother, and in the same time hold people under a regime so oppressed that people are dying not from only your bullets, but the amount of calories being entered into their territory, like in Gaza, from depression or sickness. This realization during my time as a soldier of me on the right side of history gave me this urge that something have to be done, something have to be spoken. Understanding that nothing is really changing from inside, that you have to step outside and start talking with the world about what's going on. And that's the only way you can live in a place, not only for Palestinians, but for me as well. You know, I don't want to live in an ethnocracy. I don't want to live in an only Jewish state that values privileged Jewish life on every other life. This urges me to understand that I want my kids to grow up in a place when they don't have to oppress anyone, they don't have to be soldiers. I guess that's what pushed me to do what I'm doing.
Your humanity.
Yes, indeed. Without any further ado, let's bring our brother, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, into the conversation, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam. Thank you very much for inviting me, brother.
Brother, it's good to have you. I know how this crisis has been impacting me, brother. I've been alternating uh, between pain and anger and pain, with a lot of tears in between and very little sleep over the past month. How has this impacted you? Uh, let's begin there. How has this crisis impacted you? And then from there, I'd like for you to share what your thoughts are on that little piece of video that we just saw.
Right. Again, thanks for inviting me and for your kind words. This has been a very tough few weeks since October 7th. Seeing how people are losing their lives, thousands and thousands of people, particularly women and children, have been literally butchered, killed indiscriminately by a criminal, fascist, brutal regime and ideology. What Efrat Irani was describing in this video was basically the Zionist ideology. The Zionist ideology, which calls for a settler colonialist movement for all the Jews around the world to come to Palestine while displacing, expelling Palestinians from the territory to make room for these Jewish communities from around the world. It's a supremacist, racist ideology that uses violent and aggressive means to achieve its goals. And what the Palestinians have been living under, what have been seeing, I'm a victim. My parents were a victim of this policy. They were expelled back in 1948. I was born in exile. I've been through, live in many countries, none of which I became a citizen of. I've been to Kuwait 8 years, Egypt 9, and America 40 years, 4 decades I lived there. And I always felt that as Palestinians, I was never given really any rights. And the root of the problem was the expulsion of the Palestinians. 60% of the Palestinians were expelled in 1948, when Israel occupied 78% of historical Palestine. And of course, after the 1967, it occupied the rest of it. So this trauma that the Palestinians are living under did not start on October the 7th. It really started 75 years ago. What happened on October the 7th is that for the first time, the Palestinians were trying to break out of their open-air prison, because Gaza is nothing but an open-air prison. It's a concentration camp. A lot of people obviously get offended, particularly Jewish people, when we say concentration camp, but that's exactly what it is, because they are surrounded from every area, from the sea, from the land, from the air. They can't break out. And what happened on October 7th, it was like breaking out of prison. And let's review a little bit what happened prior. What we have today in the state of Israel is the most right-wing government, the extremist government, the most extremist government that ever were in charge, particularly after Netanyahu won the last elections with his extremist partners, allies. And since the beginning of the year, they started a program. They thought that this is their historical time to complete the task that they thought they failed back in 1948, which is to make life miserable for the Palestinians, because whoever remained in the occupied territories still posed a threat to them because of their presence. Remember, back in 1948, there were only 150,000 people left in the 1948 areas. When they occupied 67, that number, of course, increased, even though they tried to expel more, but many Palestinians stayed. And today, in historical Palestine, there are more Palestinians than you have Jews, which meant that the demographic bomb was going to explode at one point. And as Efrat said in that video, we're really living under two different systems. Jews have one system and Palestinians have a completely different system, excluding, of course, the Palestinians that stayed behind. They do have some rights, but there are a lot of restrictions on them. But mostly the almost 5 million people in the West Bank and Gaza, these people have no legal rights, no political rights. They're always under the gun. They're always under all these restrictive conditions. And what happened with the emergence and presence of this extremist government, they wanted a final solution. And they actually announced what that final solution is. They said the Palestinians would have three options. One option is actually to recognize that this is a Jewish state with Jewish sovereignty, where Palestinians would have no rights except the right to reside there, as long as you acknowledge that this is a Jewish state where you don't get any legal protections or political rights. You are at the mercy of what they have. You have to acknowledge that. And if you don't, because most Palestinians wouldn't live under these conditions as a second or third class citizen, then we're going to give you compensation and then you have to leave. And if you reject that, if you refuse that, as most Palestinians would, no one's going to leave their country, then the third option is death. That's basically what they have been intimidating, pressuring the Palestinians, try to make them move or kill them. And indeed, they started different programs, three programs in particular I will mention here today, which all three contributed to what happened on October the 7th. First, they started threatening the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa Mosque is the holiest, the third holiest shrine in the Islamic world, but particularly for Palestinians, of course, it has a great symbol. It's in Jerusalem. This is where the Prophet made his holy trip to heaven, as Muslims believe, from that spot where he actually ascended to heaven, but he also met there the other prophets. So it has its particular symbol in the Islamic faith. And what they've been trying to do is try to have all kinds of incursions and trying to impose what they call a division in space and time. They wanted to divide this area where, internationally speaking, that spot, that temple, that Haram al-Sharif, we call it the Temple Mount, but we call it Al-Haram al-Sharif, where it's been recognized internationally as being solely for the Muslim faith. So they tried to impose that, and they've been bringing thousands and thousands of settlers, insulting the Muslims, insulting the Prophet, insulting the Quran, trying to impose their time and space. It was the same reason that we had a war back in 2021, and the different Palestinian resistance movements have been warning this government that you need to stop this. A lot of you have been saying, but to no avail. Actually, they were trying to say that after the holidays, meaning would have been sometime in October or November, they wanted to bring certain cows and impose this. So this was one of the reasons, but also in the West Bank, they started a program in trying to intimidate the Palestinians. So they would go to camps, cities, villages, try to arrest people arbitrarily. Since this government came, they killed 200 people between the beginning of the year and October 7th. About 20% of them were children. These people, they just go there, arrest people, and if anybody resists, they just kill them on the spot. And that's what was happening almost on a daily basis. If you count the number of days in 9 months, that almost every day you have a death, including the death of children. And of course, on top of that, they were arresting people, what is called administrative detention. In Palestine, before October 7th, it has increased dramatically since then. But since the beginning of the year and October the 7th, there were approximately 5,500 Palestinian prisoners. 1,860 of them have not been charged with any crime. They just go arrest them and book them and give them 6 months, and then they renew another 6 months and another 6 months. Few of them actually went into hunger strike, and one of them actually died during his hunger strike because they kept going there and arresting him and refusing to release him. He was just a baker who never really was a militant in any way, but they didn't like his rhetoric. They didn't like the fact that he was popular, so they would go and intimidate him. And that happened this year, by the way. This person went on hunger strike between February and May. He's over 90 days was on hunger strike, and they let him die. They actually let him die. And he was just one of the hundreds of people that have been arrested. And for these three reasons, and on top of that also, you have a 17-year siege, suffocating siege on Gaza. Since 2007, about 16 plus years, Gaza has been, as I said, an open air prison where, as Efrat said, they would count the number of calories that they do allow into Gaza. And they had a policy called mowing the lawn. So anytime they think Gaza hasn't been punished enough, they go and wage a war and they kill a few hundreds, and then they restrict what goes in and out, and they make sure that the Gazans will always be under control, under their thumb. They actually had a headquarter there called the Gaza Command. That Gaza Command was about a few miles from the Gaza border, and there you had people who would control every aspect life in Gaza, including the people. They would be monitoring everyone. So the fifth reason, so that's four reasons, and then I would say what happened. The fifth reason, of course, is that this government, particularly Netanyahu, never believed in any political settlement or political solution, despite that the United States have been calling for one, even though they have been siding with Israel, for decades. But they were still calling for what is called the two-state solution, or some kind of political settlement, which was the basis of the 1993 Oslo Accords. Israel, of course, never believed in that, particularly this government. They never had any intention of implementing anything. All what they wanted was to place settlers in the West Bank. So the number of settlers went from 125,000 back in 1993, and today between the West Bank and Jerusalem, you have about 850,000 settlers. So there was really no intention whatsoever to have a political settlement. And he always said there is no need actually to have any kind of settlement with the Palestinians. The Palestinians would just have to accept their status, which is basically an apartheid-like regime, where the Palestinians live in Bantustans, like the old South Africa, in towns. These towns would be under the rule of a corrupt Palestinian authority, and they only be about 3% of historical Palestine, where outside you have all these settlers roaming around doing whatever they like. So the siege on Gaza that has been taking place, of course, was a sore point. So for all these five reasons, the resistance in Gaza decided that they're going to go and force the Israelis to give in for some of their demands. Let's review some of these demands. They have been holding about 3 or 4 Israeli prisoners for years, and they wanted to exchange them for the Palestinian prisoners. Keep in mind that the two extremist partners of Netanyahu, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, he gave them portfolios where one is actually controlling the West Bank settlements. So he's been funding these settlers and giving them all kinds of goodies and funds to expand. And Ben Gvir has been giving a security portfolio where he would go and arm these settlers, where they would be roaming around with weapons, armed, and they would be shooting at and insulting the Palestinians. But on top of that, he was given the portfolio of being in charge of the prisoners in prison. The Palestinians, the 5,500 of them, they have won a lot of rights in the prison system throughout struggles in the years. They went into hunger strikes, and they won visitation rights, certain educational rights, certain communal prayers, and so on and so forth. This guy came out of nowhere, and he restricted that so much. He basically canceled the visitations. He made it like once every few months, the phone calls, the educational benefits, and basically he's trying to make their life miserable, to punish them. And now he's trying to introduce, in fact, bills in the Knesset asking for the death penalty for some of them that have been charged with violent acts. So this guy came with an agenda. And of course, the resistance in Gaza, those people, who belong to the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, or to other resistance movements, they couldn't take it anymore. So they wait. So what I'm trying to say is that this didn't come out of nowhere. This came out with a lot of background that people have to know about. That these restrictions, these attempts to try to make the life so difficult, so miserable for the Palestinians, so that they will give in, give up, leave, was the basis of what happened. And what happened on October the 7th is that they were the victims of their own success. They thought that they're going to go there, grab a few dozens that they can exchange, and that they will have leverage over the government in order to push them to lift the siege on Gaza. But they found out that this invincible army was a cakewalk. It was so easy to go and get them, and they attacked what I referred to earlier, which is the Gaza team. these are the Gaza command. These are the people who were controlling their lives and making it miserable. So
Yes.
they attacked them and they obliterated them basically, and they grabbed the people. And because there was so much confusion, it was many of the atrocities of killing the civilians, including the people who were in the so-called festival. Like, Hamas didn't know about this festival. And the report came yesterday in the Haaretz. All these people who were killed, they were killed by Israeli helicopters. Not only they killed a lot of the Hamas fighters, but they all killed their own people. And they reported, according to this report that came yesterday in the Haaretz, which is the largest newspaper there, they said about 200 of them were Hamas fighters, and many of them were simply the Israeli people there who were celebrating whatever they were celebrating, or a concert or something. And keep in mind that at the beginning they said 1,400 people were killed, but they have to revise this number after they found out that a lot of the people who were killed in that concert at the time were actually, and of course beyond, were Hamas fighters. So all this propaganda, the hasbara about babies being killed, about rapes, about targeting people for being Jews, it's just lies after lie.
Yes.
None of them were true. None, zero, zilch.
Yeah.
And this has come out now in full force. And under this, under these justifications, you found the U.S. government basically giving the green light to go and kill thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians, of women, and destroying all the structures, all the public structures, the schools, the hospitals, the clinics, the mosques, the churches, the medical facilities. Nothing is left of Gaza, because Israel now is trying to find the justification to complete what wasn't done in 48, which is basically the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Right. To push the Palestinians to expel them from their homeland. And they tried that, and they convinced the Secretary of State, who is partner in this crime, as well as that president, the senile president that the US has now, who is also complicit in this crime, that they bought into this narrative that they can actually push the Palestinians to the Sinai and try to raise Gaza, destroy Gaza, and so therefore that they could convince the settlers to come back. Remember that because of this war, the Israeli government had to evacuate the settlers. There are about 22 settlements and about 11 military bases, and all of them were evacuated to make room for the ground war, in the hope that they are going to finish off the resistance, raise Gaza, so that the settlers could come back. And what's happening today is that they failed miserably in trying to achieve that objective.
Dr. Sami Al-Arian, let me ask you about your thoughts on what was taking place, had been taking place for quite some time here in the West, between the West functionaries of the Zionist state operating within the West, especially within the interfaith realm, the normalization process that was underway, that involved both prominent figures, both here in the West, prominent Muslim and Christian and Jewish institutions here in the West, as well as prominent political leaders in the Arab and Muslim world. What are your thoughts on this normalization process that was taking place, and your thoughts on the response from these predominantly Arab and Muslim populated nations to this crisis?
Let me answer this on two levels. The first level is the strategic level, the geopolitical level. The United States was the preeminent, obviously, world power right after World War II, and it still is the world leading great power. It designed a world and international institutions, economic institutions, political institutions, military alliances to serve its interests, and its interest is to stay as the hegemon across the world. And of course, for about 40 years, from the late 40s to the late 80s, we had the Cold War, because there was another great power, much weaker, but still a great power, the Soviet Union, and they were competing throughout the world. The US has three strategic areas where its interests lie. Two of them are in Europe and East and Southeast Asia, and it's because of other great powers. So in Europe, it has the Soviet Union, now Russia, which is much weaker than it used to be. But still, it's the great power that can actually destabilize and threaten American interests. And that's why we have a Ukraine war today, but that's not our topic today, because the US pushed for that war, and it's financing that war, and it's going to fight it until the last Ukrainian, in order to basically have an attrition against Russia. But also you have Southeast and East Asia, where you have another rising power, which is China. China actually is the one that is posing a potential threat for the United States because of its economic boom, its economic power. Just let me tell you that back in 1992, the GDP of China was about 7% of the US. Today is about 70%. So that's an unbelievable growth in China's economy. Could actually translate into a military power, which eventually could actually threaten the interests of the United States. The interest of the United States is basically this: the US does not allow any emerging or great power to become a hegemon in its own region. For a simple reason, because if a power is comfortable in its own region, it can get out and threaten US interests in different parts of the globe. That's why we have the Monroe Doctrine. Back in 1823, the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe, had what is called the Monroe Doctrine, which was basically to end any military basis or a military presence for any great powers. And it took them about 60, 70, 80 years to do that. It ended basically with World War II, where there is no longer any military alliances in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, the U.S. establishment, they went berserk when the Soviet Union had their Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's why they were willing to bomb Cuba to get them out, because that is a red line. So the U.S. want to make sure that no other region will be dominated by any other power, because that's where the U.S. has the freedom to actually meddle and try to maintain its interest. But the second region, now we will switch. During the Cold War, Europe was number one, Asia was number three. Now we switch. Asia is number one, Europe is number three. So number two is always the Persian Gulf, the Gulf, and the Middle East, for two reasons. The biggest reason is the presence and existence of oil reserves. Most of the oil reserves, over 60%, are in that region. And whoever has access and control over these oil reserves is actually in control of the world economy. They can make it happen and they can withhold it because they have that power. And the US has maintained that power ever since after World War II. And more importantly also is because the US delinked the dollar with the gold back in 1971 during the Nixon administration. Keep in mind that part of the agreement of the US involvement in the war, in the Second World War, was that the world would accept that the dollar becomes the reserve currency of the world, when the US pledged that it would have a fixed rate with gold. That fixed rate ended in 1971, which meant that the US could print as much money as it wants without any real repercussions on its economy. And that is only true because the US had an agreement with Saudi Arabia back in 1974, which was and still one of the largest producing oil countries in the world, that what it's producing will only be sold in oil. And this is the most strategic commodity. You have about 100 million barrels a day. When it's sold in dollars, that gives America huge leverage. It can print whatever it wants because everybody wants the dollars to pay for this commodity. So we have today about 62% of world trade is in dollars, and about 80% of the foreign exchange, money exchange, is in dollars. So that gives it a lot of leverage. So the US has a lot of interest in maintaining hegemony and maintaining control and maintaining effective presence in the region. And because when it was a unipolar, the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed and before the rise of China and the weakness of Russia, we had about 25 years of what we call the unipolar moment, where the US was the sole power. It tried to come to this region and social engineering, with its invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and it failed miserably. And now but it can afford, because it was unipolar, you can afford to fail and not really pay a heavy price. But now it cannot afford to be involved and pay heavily for this. So it was trying to draw down and try to go and focus on that emergence threat of its competition with the emerging Chinese power. And to do that, it has to bring proxies, proxy powers, to maintain its interest in the region, and that would have been Israel and some of its Arab allies. So it started putting together these normalization deals. So of course, back in '79, they had the peace treatment with Egypt, in which Egypt's sovereignty was totally restricted from the Sinai, and Egypt became a very, really small country, while Egypt, historically speaking, was the biggest Arab country, but it became really no longer an effective or meaningful country in terms of leadership across the Arab world. And then it had, after the Oslo Accords, it had a peace agreement with Jordan, which always has been an American client state. And then during Trump administration, they were able to bring along the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. But really, the jewel of the crown would have been Saudi Arabia, which Biden has been and his team have been trying to bring on and bring this normalization deal next year with between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would have bypassed, of course, the Palestinian issue altogether, but it would have handed down the task of maintaining American effective control and hegemony and interest to these client states. And the major protagonist, the major problem would have been Iran and some of its allies, mostly resistance movements in Lebanon and Palestine, and also in Iraq and other places like Yemen. And they wanted to just keep them off without having to destabilize the system and keep that system under control and try to move and concentrate on China. That was the geopolitical scene. Now, keep in mind that domestically speaking, because your question was asking about domestically, that Israel is the only issue for the United States, not only as a geopolitical issue, strategic issue, where Israel becomes a functional state to maintain U.S. objectives overseas. That's why Biden has always said that if there were no Israel, we would have invented an Israel, because the Zionist state serves that role. That it's like the advanced military base for the United States to maintain order in this region, to make sure that this region will always be on edge, will always be fragmented, weak, controlled, and dependent, and so on and so forth. Israel serves that purpose, and it has for many decades. But there is also another thing with Israel that no other issue enjoys in the US, that Israel is also a domestic issue. Unlike any other issues, there is no other lobby or constituency within the US society that can actually impact the foreign policy except for Israel. So Israel is not only a foreign policy objective and issue and geopolitical concern, but it's also a domestic issue. And that's due basically to the presence of a strong Jewish and Zionist lobby. When I say Jewish, I mean in this context that they only look at Israel as being a representative of the Jewish people, which I totally disagree with, because I make a distinction between Judaism as a religious faith and Zionism as a political movement that is trying to basically displace the Palestinians and use and redefine Jews in ethnic terms instead of being members of the Jewish faith. I think that's where so this whole thing about anti-Semitic, I don't buy this, and I totally reject it. because anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Jewishness is anti-Semitism. And that's what I draw the line. This is not about Jews and Muslims. This is about Zionists, and this is about aggression. And this is what this is about. And the Zionist lobby, there's no one is going to dispute the fact that they have great influence with the political establishment, with the political elites and the ruling elites in the United States. And they try to convince basically the ruling elites and society at large, including many institutions, which are basically very important in society, that Israel's objectives and Israel's interests are the same as America's interest. And now we see that in some areas where the American political establishment after October 7th have basically given the Israelis the green light to restore this deterrent impact that has been shattered, that came crashing down on October the 7th. Mm-hmm. And they just basically gave them whatever they want. And that meant that they could use brutal force in order to restore this image. See, what happens is that on October the 7th, the image of this invincible army, of these superior intelligence services have been shattered. Right. So this image in the region before the Israeli people is gone. So they're trying to restore this image by changing this scene of being a defeated army into a strong army by killing as many Palestinian women and children and devastating and destroying Gaza so that they can change that image. And of course, what it's doing is that it actually awakened the people. Now, everybody in America who has a conscience is asking these questions: what's going on here? And we have seen the hundreds of thousands, the millions of people, not only in the United States, but across the world, basically seeing Israel for what it is. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, this has been an eye-opening experience for millions of people around the world, particularly in the United States, particularly for young people, where now they are seeing what's happening, that they have been lied to all these years, that they have been deceived, that this whole thing about finding a land without a people to people without a land was just a lie, was deception, was never the case, was never true, and that the Palestinians were the owners of the land, were people who actually lived in the land, and that there is a whole other history to this conflict than that they have been led to know, they have been led to believe. And now I think what we're going to see, this is not going to be reflected, by the way, in the political establishment soon, because the political establishment, its interest is pretty much tied to these Zionist interests, whether because of money interest, because of political affiliations, or because of the historical political experiences in America. But believe me, this is going to change. It's going to take some time, but it would change, because these structural changes are taking place at the root in America, with the rise of the social media, that people now are getting their information not simply from the mainstream media.
Network. That's right. Yes.
They're trying to suppress the real story. We're seeing a different picture emerging right now.
My brother, subhanAllah, I knew that this hour was going to go fast, and it is. We just have just a very, 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 very few short minutes left. I think a good place to end is where you just touched upon, because we also have another very short video that we want to show, and we just literally have just a few short minutes left. I'm going to ask you to respond in 2 minutes max, 1 to 2 minutes in response to this question that you just touched upon in part. George Washington's farewell address to the Union, when he made that address, within that address, he delivered a warning to his compatriots then, and a warning that remained all the way through the, however long this experiment in quote unquote democracy would go on. He warned against the United States having the kind of relationship with any nation that it today has with the state of Israel. This very toxic and compromising relationship that could be destructive to the interests of the United States. With that being said, one of the things that I have been really enthused about over the past month, one of the silver linings to all of this madness, has been the demonstrations that have taken place here in the United States and in other parts of the world. Here in the U.S., all over the U.S., and other parts of the world. Cumulatively, millions of people just in the U.S., not speaking about, major capitals and northeast, western, and the southern part of the world, just here in the U.S. It's been tremendous. And I believe that we have reached a tipping point that indicates that, the Zionists and its lobby and its affiliates have really overplayed their hand. And, can't go back. We will never be able to go back to yesterday. Despite the heavy-hearted nature of this for me and for you and for many others, I'm also greatly encouraged by what I'm seeing. I think that would be a good ending point for you to touch upon in just a maximum 2-minute response. What are your thoughts on what we have been seeing in the way of demonstrations and what this posits for tomorrow and a new beginning around this very challenging issue?
Right. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go over what I'm about to say, but I would be very happy to join you in the future and to elaborate and to say. And
we can do a part 2, inshallah. We can do a part 2.
Certainly. But I'm very optimistic that we are seeing the end of the apartheid Israeli style. This is going to take some time. The struggle is not done yet, but I think we are on that path. I think what's going to happen at the end of this war, there will be 3 different options that could, or 3 different scenarios, I should say. And with each scenario, which I don't have time to go over, with each scenario, it's going to end up with the end of apartheid in Palestine, Israel-Palestine, which I think is going to give us an opportunity, and particularly with this opening that we see in the United States, this is going to really accelerate this process, where I think, I wasn't sure if we're going to see this within my lifetime, but I think I have a shot at it, that we can actually see the end of apartheid in Palestine in my lifetime. But certainly it will be in the lifetime of my children and my grandchildren. But I'm very, very, very optimistic, despite the pain and the suffering and the devastation taking place. I think the world now is starting to open their eyes. I think we are about to turn the leaf and the page on a new world order. And I think the United States has been exposed. It's the policies of the United States have been exposed to the point that the world no longer has any respect, and they will demand change, real change, genuine change, and it's going to start in Palestine.
Alhamdulillah. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to do a part 2 on this, Brother Sami, inshallah ta'ala. But for now, I want us to end with a short video that will be a good ending point for today's conversation. Thank you, brother, for joining us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us all globally, but especially our brothers and sisters in occupied Palestine and especially Gaza, with the fruits of relief sooner rather than later. Ameen. With that, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihati wa tawassaw bil haqq wa tawassaw bis sabr. Let's end with that piece of video. Thank you. Thank you for joining.
How does anybody view what's happening in Palestine as anything but genocide and an ethnic cleansing?
Israel just bombed a fucking hospital in Gaza. Over 500 innocent civilians are now dead.
anyone saying turn off your phone and don't look at what's happening in Gaza is wrong for that. Anyone with a heart would care.
I have not been able to sleep in days.
I'm seeing these videos of kids and babies. It's fucking horrible. And kids and babies that are all been watched. Like, all their family have died.
They literally sent innocent women and children to the south of Gaza in order to protect them. Hey, if you want to be away from the bombing, go there. You have 24 hours. And then bombed the south of Gaza and all of the roads leading there that they told them to take. How is this legal? Like, literally, how is this not a war crime?
No, I'm just one little person and I don't have a lot of power. I have no power really, but is there anything I can do? Is there anything we can do to stop this? Is there anything we can do? Like, who's got some ideas? Because, man, I feel ashamed to be a human right now, watching this happen and watching people celebrate it. What is looking wrong with us?
This is not a mistake of like, ooh, we were after a terrorist and we accidentally hit a fucking hospital. Like, holy shit, if you are still supporting the government of Israel at this point, you are a genocidal maniac.
I watched a man carry his children in waste bags because there was not enough of his children and they weren't in one piece, so he could not carry them continuously.
Like, how can you do that? How can you see suffering and not care? How can you see the fourth largest military in the world cause mass suffering and not care? These people are being wiped out right now.
I can't wrap my mind around how you're still posting pictures of your lunch to social media and you've said nothing about the genocide in Gaza.
No electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed. You sick, dirty. You kill people, starve them to death.
After the horrendous bombing of the Baptist hospital in Gaza, Joe Biden has arrived in Israel. He has embraced the war criminal Netanyahu, and he said, quote, "It appears as though it was done by the other team, not you." A disgusting comment in line with the disgusting policy of US support for Israeli ethnic cleansing.
In this video, I want to talk directly to the BBC. Stop trying to attempt to manufacture consent from the British people to support a country that right now is threatening to do things so bad I can't even say the words on social media. The British people are not behind this. Do not speak for us. We do not support what is going on right now and what you are trying to get us to support.